All right, so for today's agenda, we are going to be talking about reproducibility and replicability and why you should care. We will cover some technical aspects, but I think that this piece of why you should care is really important as we hope to um, make known throughout the presentation. We will also be talking about some issues related to reproducibility, including data fraud and falsification, some contemporary examples of reproducibility problems, how we got here, thinking about making research reproducible. We will talk a tiny bit about AI considerations, and there will be a wrap-up and Q&A at the end. So could I get the next slide, please? Okay, so for those of you who have joined us for some of the other workshops in the Data Journey series, you may be familiar with this image of the data skills web. So basically, there's like interrelated skills and knowledge that are important when we are working with data. One thing that you will notice is that there isn't a specific label for reproducibility in this data skills web. And I think that part of it is reproducibility really is the outcome of having best practices in all of the other skills. So when you are following the best practices for planning, obtaining, describing, cleaning, analyzing, evaluating, sharing, and storing, you are in a way proving your data for successful reproducibility and replicability. Could I get the next slide, please? All right, so we're going to start with why you should care. But before we do that, we will look at some definitions that sometimes can be confusing, which is the difference between reproducibility and replicability. So reproducibility really talks about end results. So if you have the same data set and you run the same types of tests and the same types of analysis using the same tools, you should get the exact same results as the original researcher. So that's reproducible research. Replicable research, on the other hand, is less about the outputs and it's more about the process. So for example, let's say that you are doing some data collection for, I don't know, some kind of like social science problem that you're trying to understand. And you collect, your data from a sample that you have designed. You find the people that are going to be helping you, as participants of your study. So it's going to be very unlikely that somebody will reproduce exactly the same results as you, because somebody else will, not have access to the exact same sample that you did in the exact same conditions. But your documentation of your process, like how big was your sample, who was included, what were your criteria for selection, all of those things will make the research that you're working with replicable. So somebody else could go and do similar research using a different population, a different sample, and ideally they would be able to get results that can be compared to your own research. Could I get the next slide? And I believe that's off to you, Elise.
Yeah, thank you. So as everyone can see here, this is a really busy slide of a ton of different headlines, most of which are fairly recent and kind of touch on reproducibility in an, they touch on reproducibility in a number of different ways. So you can see things like paper retractions, fraud, papers disappearing from the internet, disgraced scientists, plagiarism, untrustworthy clinical trials. I'm not sure about everyone else, but I would ideally like clinical trials to be as trustworthy as possible. And all of these things are not ideal. They speak to science that leaves a number of things to be desired, and they're not really the ideal outcome when we think of research that's trustworthy, credible, and reproducible. And no one wants to be the scientist that ends up with research that's retracted. And this isn't to say that papers that are retracted are automatically bad. This is part of kind of the scientific process and publishing. And there are very valid reasons why something might be retracted. But when we see the number of retractions soaring and year over year and within a specific field, it kind of indicates that maybe there are some issues with reproducibility and replicability here, and maybe there are some issues with the underlying science and the culture behind it as well. And when we think about, well, how do we get here? How do we solve this? What is the issue here? There's always going to be kind of bad actors in this space. But again, when we see the number of retractions kind of growing at this rapid rate, and more we're talking about data fraud, data falsification at the rate at which we are today, and when we see we're in this space of kind of misinformation, disinformation, and pulling results that are kind of odd and feel off to a lot of people and kind of just making up things as we go, how do we actually solve this issue? And when you look at some of the retraction notices that you see, a lot of them will end up being data related, where either the data wasn't deposited and people are no longer confident in the results, or people weren't able to reproduce the results, or image duplication is another one where people will find issues with some of the images or plots that people have used in their publications, and those papers end up retracted. And oftentimes those papers still continue to be cited because the way we retract papers isn't that they disappear forever. The internet is forever and they live there because they're still part of that scientific record. But when we put out bad science into the world and bad research into the world, it makes it a lot more difficult for people to kind of wade through what is true, what is not true, what do we even know, and really trust that science. And this is where reproducibility and replicability really come into play and why it really matters. So we share our data to kind of contribute to this, but it matters a lot because of when we put bad research out into the world, we kind of create this sense of questionable credibility. And this isn't something that can be built back up quickly, but it's also not something that happens overnight. So in the last decade or so, for more so than previously, we've seen kind of people, the public, and kind of the general population starting to question the results of science, saying, well, hey, if we found out that this isn't true, how do we know that this other thing is true? And we've really seen people starting to doubt the science that's put out there and have doubt in research in the academy, and funding decreases because of kind of this de-emphasis on research and what that means. And not all of this is because research isn't reproducible. This is a very nuanced issue and a lot of things going into this, but we've definitely seen an increase in calls for transparency and questions about, was that research good? We see lots of things in headlines about people losing their jobs because of fraudulent research, or people at Harvard, Princeton, like huge schools where you think they can't possibly do anything wrong. But we're seeing these issues really come out of the woodwork, and they're not things that we can solve overnight. And when we look at what some of these other issues are, a lot of them are due to reproducibility because they've kind of cut corners, or their research isn't documented. So down the road, people will go and try to look at the research, reproduce it, or replicate it in some way and find errors in that. And this is a really hard number to estimate because reproducing research and doing replicability studies are incredibly expensive. But we do know that no matter what that estimation is, they're suboptimal. And you're never going to get to 100% because there are reasons why something might not be reproducible or replicable. And we'll talk about that later with some of the AI stuff. But if it's not close to that, maybe there are some issues with that. And we notice this a lot right now and in the past with the negative impacts on health outcomes in public health. And when you look at kind of the world around us, not only in Canada, but in North America broadly, we really see how this degrading of credibility and how we've eroded trust in science has impacted public health. And I'll talk about that as an example in a minute as well. But eroding our trust in science doesn't happen overnight, but it's a lot harder to build that trust back up when we get when we've broken it down. So if we really work with this reproducibility and replicability to keep that trust in science, to be transparent about the research we're doing and as transparent as possible, that's when we can start having people trust in the process and building that trust in science back up. And when we think about reproducibility, it's not just other people reproducing their own research. And I think this is an interesting graphic, and I'm sure many people have read it from the original reproducibility crisis paper. But on the left, you'll see people who tried to reproduce their own experiments. And it's not at 100%. So people are unable to reproduce their own research and their own experiments 100% of the time. And it's not even 80% or 70% of the time, which makes you think of, why are people not able to reproduce their own results? And what is the issue here? And there's a number of things going on, and you're never going to kind of find out all of the reasons, but a big one will be kind of documentation, and who are poorly documenting their own research and writing down what they've done, or losing files, or not having the data to reproduce it at all. I know we're all kind of it's easy to say that I'm going to remember what my code means down the road, not comment it, or I'm going to remember what's in this file and not document it. And then a couple months, maybe a year down the road, you look at it and you're like, I have no idea what this means. I know I told myself I would remember, but I really don't. So when we see people reproducing their own work at a low level, and obviously not everyone is trying to reproduce their own work all the time, but this really makes you think of, is this just a fraud issue? Is this just a methods issue? But there's a lot of things going on here. And you can see some of the issues on the right. While fraud isn't the most prevalent issue, it's pretty concerning at the rate that it is. It makes you question, how do we kind of solve these issues? Because none of these are great. The selective reporting, the pressure to publish, and we'll talk about this later. These all kind of contribute to where we are now and thinking about, where do we go from here? And reproducibility and replicability, and again, these are subtly different, and you'll find that we will occasionally use them interchangeably throughout this, or other people will use them interchangeably. They are subtly different, but they're both really integral to creating research that's reliable. And you want things to be replicable so you can verify the findings and say, I know this person did this, and I've reproduced this, and can say that, yes, I found the same thing as this other person. And then we're not left to just blindly trust that the science is correct or their findings are correct. And this is really important because it's kind of, it's the scientific process, and that you're able to reproduce and say that, yes, this is correct. You might want to replicate it with a different population study or with some slightly different factors and say, we still found the same things. And ultimately, that's really good for population health and health studies, but just science as a whole and research as a whole. It also increases and maximizes the transparency of research. It's easy for people to doubt research and doubt the science when it's kind of behind closed doors and you don't know what's happening, and you've just given public dollars to researchers to do something, and they've come out with this research and said, I have these really cool splashy findings, but I'm not going to tell you how I got them. That's a secret. And that then you just have to kind of blind faith and have blind faith in these people and these researchers, which becomes increasingly hard when we do have bad actors out there and kind of suspicious research that makes you question things. And ultimately, this all goes back to building that trust in science, building that trust in research. And I think this is really important right now, as we've seen the real world impacts of reproducibility, or the lack thereof, in the last couple of years, especially. And talking about some kind of the specific issues of reproducibility, what are some things that contribute to that? And what are some of the things we see that are issues that contribute to things being not reproducible? Sorry, my slides are having a time. So when we look at these issues, we see things like obsolete programs. When you go to reproduce something or run a test that someone did and they've saved the file, it's something that can only be open in a program that's from the 90s. I know the fields I do research in the very specific niche area. The program was made by an anthropologist in the 90s, and I don't know if anyone keeps it up to date. And it's a great program, but if something ever happens to that, what happens to the people who work in that program and the data that we use? And luckily, we're able to save things in open source formats and could do that in a different program. But even though it's it is an open source program, it's really obsolete at this time. It's 30 years old. There's nothing being done to it. So kind of thinking about what programs are we using to do things in, and which programming languages are we doing things in? Is it a proprietary one? Is it an open source language? And these things are important to think about as we go forward, because they kind of contribute to everything we do. If you can't read the data, if the data is unreadable, if you don't understand the documentation or don't have the programs available to you to even try reproducing the data, how do you go forward from there at all? And this kind of leads to that unreadable data. And this can mean any number of things. It can be data that hasn't been cleaned properly or cleaned at all, or data that's in some coded format that you can't decode, or you can't access the data at all. Unreadable data could mean that files are corrupt as well. But we see this is an issue in a lot of places where the data is just not accessible. And if it's not accessible, you can't do anything with it. Another really classic thing that you find is everything is in the article. And this is something that we're starting to see a cultural shift in, to people depositing data and depositing information about their methods as part of README files and keeping that documentation separate and in the article. But something that's really common, even when I do data deposits, is when I ask for this information, I get it's in the article, it's in the methods section. They have to read my paper too. But this really separates the methods from the data. And when those methods aren't available with the data, the data is not helpful at all either. It's really helpful to have these two packages separate, and they need to be connected to each other. But the methods and the information about the data is really important to have with the data itself as well. And we can embargo the data and work around kind of paper publication schedules as well. But it's important that that be included with the data and not just with the paper, because the barriers to accessing those papers can also be really high. People may not have access to those papers, or vice versa. So having those things kind of separate and connected is important. And this goes towards kind of can't find the data as well. And this can mean any number of things. It could be data available upon request. The data isn't labeled, so you don't know what's in it. It's on someone's computer. You can't find your own data, so you can't reproduce the data. And this is a really common one when you've kind of named files miscellaneously and don't know what's in them, and you can't find your own data, can't reproduce the data, or can't reproduce the studies, or you have a number of versions of the files and you don't know which version was used to run a certain experiment, what have you, and still can't find the data at the end of the day. Only having one copy of the data is another thing that we see as kind of an issue here. Something happens to your computer, something happens to a hard copy of the data. It's more common than you would think. So backing up your data is really important, because if your only copy of the data is destroyed somehow or lost or corrupted somehow, how do you do anything with those to reproduce the data or reproduce the studies? You just have to kind of trust, because the data is no longer available. And we see this probably a little bit more with data that's not digitized or not digital. We still see it a lot with digital data, but it's maybe a little bit less common. And with those physical copies of data, you see people who maybe published a paper 10, 20 years ago, had one copy of the data, didn't think they would use it again. Now someone would like it to check out the results of their publication, and the data's gone. There was only one copy. They don't know where it is. It was lost somehow. Any number of issues kind of contribute to this issue. And then the data contains unknown acronyms. I know in my past research days, pre-RDM days, I was sometimes really bad for this, for developing my own acronyms, and I knew what they were, but maybe everyone on my research team didn't know what they were. So I hadn't written them down anywhere as best as I could. And some of them I still remember, but sometimes I look at the acronyms in my file names and wonder, hey, I wonder what this is, which ends up leading to having to redo tests and whatnot, not to reproduce them, but just because I don't have the data available to reproduce my own results, because I don't know what's in them, because I can't read my own file names. Other common things we see, and this is a really big one in universities where students who are working in big labs, is when grad students are onboarded and offboarded. So grad students do a lot of really fabulous work, and oftentimes that work stays with the lab. But if it's not documented well and that student has left and you have no contact information, how do you find out what they did, what that grad student did? And it's probably really great work, but if you can't contact them or didn't ask ahead of time and don't have that documented somewhere, it makes it really hard to kind of reproduce anything the grad student did if all you have is kind of a file folder filled with all of their data and what have you, but you can't parse through any of it without knowing that. Author ambiguity is another issue we see a little bit with reproducibility, and this isn't going to be an issue for everyone. I know there are very few Anneliese Ebers doing rat teeth research out in the world. I think there's probably no other ones. But if you're, say, a John Smith doing cancer research, there are probably other John Smiths doing cancer research. So if you need to reach out to an author who has done certain research and their email's not available anymore, they've moved institutions, how do you find that author to contact them and follow up anymore? And we are seeing a lot of movement in here in terms of kind of ORCID numbers for researchers. So having that persistent identifier for researchers, so it's tied to them and their name, not to the institution, is really helpful. And we've talked about this kind of throughout, but not having documentation about the data contributes to all of these. Having falsified or fabricated data somehow also contributes to all of these bad actors. And this isn't to say that all data is maliciously falsified or fabricated. There are certainly times when this might be done unintentionally or by mistake, but that intentional falsification and fraudulent data is really a problem. And then incomplete data or documentation. And when I mentioned, or when I talk about data fraud and falsification, there's a number of things that people think about when they hear this. And this is, there's a number of, there's different definitions for this and people understand this differently. But when we talk about data fraud, it's kind of that intentional altering, fabricating, and misrepresenting the data. And that's the key here. There are going to be times when it's kind of unintentional and not negligence or malicious. And that's kind of, it's different than fraud because you haven't intentionally committed anything. It might be a misrepresentation of the data, but people are cautious about what they call this here. And this is really altering the data to present a false picture. So you can see on the right, I've circled kind of one blue triangle that's off to the left. It doesn't really match where the rest of the blue triangles are. This is really inconvenience because what do you do with this outlier? How do you explain this outlier? Is it a methodological issue? Is it a sampling issue? What is it? And it would be a lot easier if I just ignored this blue triangle here. And I will say that this is from some of my own research that I've done, and it would be a lot easier if that blue triangle wasn't there. It's led to a lot of questions. But if I just erase that one outlier, what have I done there? I've really altered the data, and I'm presenting a false picture in that sense because I'm not saying that, I'm now saying that all of the blue triangles are really clustered in this one area. But in actuality, there's a blue triangle that's a ways away from everything else. And how do you explain that? And I've now changed the values and results from the data. I'm no longer truly representing the data I have. And maybe I go back and I see that the sample that represents that blue triangle is an issue and shouldn't be included. But then you go back, remove that from the original sample, rerun your tests, and now you might have something different. But you've gone to look at why that outlier is there, not just erased it from a plot or ignored it because it's a lot of work to consider it. And again, this data falsification can occur without malicious intent. It could be negligence or misunderstanding of the data, or something that people accidentally do a lot is not using statistics correctly. I know I went into grad school research saying, I don't do math. I do science. I don't do math. I'm not very good at statistics. And then taking statistics classes, I was like, oh, this isn't as difficult as I thought it was, and do more with it now. But I'm not the only person like that in the world. And it can be really easy to say, this is the statistic I need, and not having the appropriate expertise in a research project and kind of just applying statistics as you think they should be, but sometimes they're incorrect. And we do see some issues with kind of data falsification that come out of not correctly using statistics. And this is a concern as well. So grad students take statistics courses. I know they suck and can be frustrating, but they are important. But when we look at some of the modern day examples of what is this bad research and what are some of the issues with it, and this is one of my favorite examples to talk about, and I did not realize that in 2025 it would be the modern example that just keeps on giving. But I'm sure everyone is familiar with the 1998 claim that vaccines cause autism. So they concluded in the paper that the MMR vaccine causes autism, but there was a number of issues with that paper, and it was a small sample of case reports. It wasn't a huge study. The data was fraudulent, so it couldn't be replicated. And the paper was retracted. It's been retracted for a number of years. But in the time between 1998 and 2025, we've somehow, as a society, started talking about all vaccines cause autism. It kind of just almost like a game of telephone has gone from the MMR vaccine causes autism to now vaccines cause autism. And this has really fueled vaccine skepticism and anti-vaccination movements. And we're seeing the real world effects of this now in 2024, 2025, where we're seeing a decreased rate in vaccination rates, and we are seeing measles outbreaks. And I know when I was younger, I never heard about measles outbreaks. It was kind of a rare thing. I know kind of people my parents' age had measles before the MMR vaccine was out, but it wasn't something you talked about. People just didn't have measles. Whereas now I know a number of people who have children who had measles outbreaks at their school, or you hear about how many cases Ontario has. And this kind of leads to questions of how did this happen? So we've really seen an increase in cases of vaccine preventable diseases because we're now talking about something that was retracted a number of years ago, but just because something is retracted from the scientific literature doesn't mean that people automatically forget about it, and doesn't mean the public automatically forgets about it. And this has really led to reinvestigating a connection between vaccines and autism and saying that we know what causes autism, and that's a whole other can of worms. But you can see how this pipeline of one study over the course of almost 30 years now has kind of led to a new issue that we're dealing with today. And it was proven pretty quickly that the data was fraudulent and the data wasn't a good study. But you sow the seeds of questionability in here, and then what do you do with that information? And you're not able to control where the public goes with things or how news reports things, and that can be really difficult. So it's really important to be responsible with the research that we do now, because if we're putting out bad research and irresponsible research, you never know what happens. And that's an excellent point in the comment in the chat. It really causes a trust issue. And what happens when they do the study the next time? Will they believe the results? Will anyone believe the results? And now we've seen things come out with Tylenol and whatnot. Are people going to believe anything else from that? Because we've already we have this one study and then we pulled it back. That trust issue is really important, and building up that trust is incredibly difficult to do, especially when the broader public has kind of taken this idea and it's grown, it's caused an entire movement. And while this can't be tied back to an individual issue of reproducibility and replicability, you can see how this has kind of contributed to that as well. And I'll hand it to Antonio to talk about another modern example.
All right, so the other example is relevant in our context because it speaks to a technology that is increasingly permeating all academic and non-academic circles, namely AI. So you may have heard of the news story where the Australian government, like the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, commissioned a report from a private company, Deloitte, and it was published. And later, some professor from an Australian university identified that there were a lot of errors, primarily related to fabricated sources of information, incorrect citations, basically, as well as fabricated quotes from federal court. So again, in this example, there was like a financial cost. The company agreed to refund the last payment. But also there is a problem with the erosion of public trust. And again, like this was not necessarily the government acting on their own behalf, but governments are responsible for, managing their resources and their budget in ways that hopefully are responsible, and commissioning a report to a third party that will turn over something that is not true or that is filled with inaccuracies is problematic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the issues with AI later, but just like something again to understand that reproducibility is not just an issue in academia. It can have implications outside in the wider world. And for those of you who work in academia, it is part of those reasons why we should care about these topics. And with that, I think that I will hand it over to you again.
Awesome. Thanks, Antonio. So I want to just touch on a couple things about how we got here, because I do think it's important to understand kind of both the structural and individual reasons we got here. And I won't go into depth in a lot of these, but it's the issues with reproducibility and replicability and the amount of bad science we see out there and irresponsible science isn't just because of bad actors. There's a number of kind of structural issues that we see with institutions and with kind of the broader academic culture that create and foster some of these issues. So things like misaligned incentives of tenure and promotion. You have to publish quickly. You want those publication metrics. You're prioritizing the quantity over quality in a lot of places because that's what you need to get tenure. So we really see these kind of structural issues that contribute to this even if they didn't directly cause the issue. And they just kind of it's kind of like a cyclical cycle that just keeps on feeding itself, where it's hard to break because doing the type of responsible and replicable research does take additional time and money to do. But we also see it from kind of the publisher side of things, where they're less likely to report negative results because it's not as flashy. It doesn't look as good. You're probably not going to get a Nature paper that says, hey, I did this study and I found out that I was wrong about my hypothesis. It was incorrect. People are unlikely to publish those things because they just don't get published as easily, and journals often resist publishing these null results or replication studies. So if you take the time to reproduce a study to find something was either true or not true, journals are less likely to publish those results, and that kind of removes the incentive to do the study if you can't publish it, and therefore can't use it towards these towards your tenure and promotion things. So you can kind of see that this is really kind of not a growing issue, but the more you look at it, the more you're like, oh, this contributes. It's not a single issue you can kind of address, but it's really a cultural issue in a lot of ways that will hopefully get addressed. And we are seeing some shifts that we'll touch on later, but it's a much deeper issue than it is on the surface. And with publishers as well, you'll often see things like papers getting rejected for a lack of contribution. Is it contributing as much to say, I did this study and my hypothesis was correct? That's great. But sometimes it'll say, well, you found it was wrong, so maybe that's not considered a lack of, or considered the same kind of contribution. And this is where we see publishers deciding what is and what isn't of scientific merit, and not the researchers and the people with that expertise. And this can lead to publication bias, where you're publishing primarily positive results or hypothesis supporting things rather than both sides of the data. But there are some things on the individual level. So you do see questionable research practices like excluding outliers, which we mentioned, not reporting unsatisfactory results for any number of reasons. You can still report those results even if they don't get published. They can be put elsewhere, or you can try and publish them. And again, I recognize that this does take additional time and money, but it is something that contributes to this. Not reporting negative results. Those are kind of two different things. If you look at something and say, I'm just not happy with the results from this versus something was negative, those are kind of two different sides of results you didn't want. Lack of access to methodological information and research data, maybe they're separate. We've talked about kind of that already. And the mismanagement of data sets or data where, and maybe this isn't malicious, it doesn't have to be, it can just be, I accidentally deleted my data, or my data was corrupt, or I didn't back it up and it was lost. And this all kind of comes down to the person's research data management practices and whether they've kind of created those backups, name files appropriately, and done everything they can to manage the data that they have so that they'll be able to create that open and transparent research as much as possible. And then we also see cognitive bias and things, and this can come out in a number of ways that I won't touch on more, but there's a lot of things that go into those individual practices where maybe you just want those positive results, so you're not looking at the data a certain way. It can really come out in different ways in different disciplines. But how do we actually make the research reproducible? We know what all of the issues are and how to do some of it. We know what we shouldn't do, but how do we actually do it? Data sharing is a big piece. When we share data, then we're making things open, we're making things as transparent as possible. And with that transparency comes the incremental increase in in that trust and building that trust by saying that I'm willing to be completely open here. People are more likely to trust that, and people can go back and fact check things. And there are issues with that as well, but it's a good step towards reproducing the research that we have. Ethical data collection and analysis, we've touched on this a number of times throughout, but really making sure that you're doing things in the most ethical way possible. And that's not necessarily as per REB approval, but ethical to the research and being responsible to the research. So not only is it ethical data collection, but responsible data collection analyses. Proper reporting, and this can be reporting negative results, unsatisfactory results, reporting things, outliers, not duplicating or not altering images. This is any number of things here, but really being true to the research when you do that reporting. And the big one is proper documentation and better documentation. There's no such thing as kind of the perfect documentation, but really just making that effort to write down what you've done and document your processes throughout makes a huge difference. And how do we make it reproducible? Kind of the larger level, integrating these conversations about open science and research into the curriculum, into having these conversations as grad students with your PIs and vice versa. So you're having conversations about what does it mean to do reproducible research and responsible research. Doing replication projects as part of graduate work. It's a really great example of something that graduate students might find helpful in this. It teaches a lot of other skills as you do that as well, but there's a number of ways that we can kind of do this replication work, also being cognizant that this work and the burden of doing that shouldn't be placed on students, but it is an example of kind of things that people might do as a project or as part of some coursework, as reproducing part of a study as part of a stats course, what have you. Robust research sharing or research data sharing of code, software, the full data, and that additional statistics training to support the creation of that code, software, and data. One thing I've heard a number of times is that there are lots of disciplines that use various code and statistical programming languages like R to do work, but because we're not programmers, sometimes the code that we write is not ideal. It's not great. And programmers will look at that and it's kind of weird. So if you do extra statistical training and extra training that way, we can be more confident that the work we're putting out there and more confident that the work we're putting out there is actually correct. Publishing negative null data. This is, again, one of those really structural changes that needs to happen. And one of those kind of shifts in incentive is needed. Right now, we don't have any incentive to do that type of work. And especially with the rapid changes in higher education that we're seeing right now, it's even harder to want to do those things because everyone is competing for fewer jobs. We're seeing kind of the erosion of that higher education market. So we really don't have those incentives. So this is going to be a really big core cultural change that hopefully happens. And then robust documentation and research data management is a really key way to make data reproducible. And these can be roughly sorted into kind of community change, structural change, and procedural changes. There's no one correct way that's going to get us all of the way there, but they all contribute little bits so that we kind of move forward towards this better culture of research and making research responsible and reproducible. And when we think about research data management and reproducibility, I'm sure everyone is familiar with kind of the research data lifecycle if you've been to one of the data journeys workshops before or do an ERDM yourself. But it's important to consider data management at all stages of your project, from planning to processing, preserving, and sharing and reusing the data. So not just thinking about your project and then the data as you move through the movements to do that, but really thinking about maybe at the planning stage. How am I going to share this data? What are people going to need when they go to reuse this data? And thinking about your project holistically from the beginning will help you kind of mitigate some of these challenges as you go and also anticipate them before you hit them. Following those ethical data collection and analysis processes, again, is really important, in documenting the things that you do so people can see that the processes that you went through, you're being transparent about that. And maybe there's a small error that's not a big deal that someone might point out. And I know as researchers, it can be really hard to kind of accept that scrutiny and put things out and be vulnerable that someone might point out something that is incorrect. But this is an important part of kind of that learning process and kind of recognizing that we are humans and we can't be perfect and we don't know everything. But then again, just planning for research to be reproducible from the beginning. So when I say planning with research data management, that can involve creating a data management plan, but also just planning throughout the whole process. And when you're creating that data management plan, creating it in such a way that you're being intentional that the research should be reproducible and replicable at the end of the research project. If not by the broader community, but by yourself in general. And we can do that with also documentation, not just the data management plan, but documenting things as you go. So things like a code book, or a data dictionary, or a README file, and creating whatever type of documentation that you need so that the data is going to be reproducible and the research is going to be reproducible. And commenting your code as you go. It's easy to say that I am going to remember what this means in a couple days, and code is notorious for, I don't know what this line does. And you see lots of things and people talking out there of, I don't know what this line does in my research, but it works. So I'm just going to keep it there. But not knowing what your code is doing can be a problem, because when you put it out there, or when someone tries to reproduce it, if you can't say what all of the things do, how is someone else supposed to know what they do? And then we've talked about kind of a number of these already. Creating fair data, not just for other people, but for yourself. Creating fair data really starts with making sure it's fair for you. And when we say fair, we mean findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And before it could be all of these things for other people, if you can't find your own data, it can't be reusable for someone else. So creating data that's easily readable, it doesn't have acronyms, or you've described the acronyms, no unexplained or missing values. It's okay to have missing values, but making sure to document why they are missing, so people don't go and say, hey, did someone just delete this number, or was it an outlier? Why is this missing? And just being transparent about that process. Creating data that's easily findable and accessible on your own computer. Creating file names that help you facilitate that finding and accessible process. Being able to open it in different programs that aren't obsolete. So choosing to save something as a CSV file or a tab file instead of an Excel spreadsheet can really make the difference. I know trying to open a spreadsheet from 1998 Excel in a new format can be difficult, and sometimes the formatting is weird. So planning for that now when you do research for future you can make a world of difference. Creating clear information about ownership and copyright, so creating an open license, or just being really clear about what someone can or can't do with that research can help people down the road reuse it. And also having clear contact information. Contact information can be kind of something that's difficult when people have institutional emails, and that's the email they use when they publish a paper, but you don't keep the institutional email when you move. So creating clear contact information might look like attaching an ORCID number to a paper, or attaching it to other work that you do, so people can still kind of track the history of that data and track contact authors if they need to. And I will turn it back to Antonio.
All right, we are going to shift gears. I am just being mindful of time, so I'm going to go over some of the AI replicability and reproducibility issues. And I want to kind of like preface this by saying none of this is really, the metaphor that I always use is the difference between a map and the GPS. So all of the things that I'm going to talk about are kind of like this like big picture map, which is telling you where things are roughly, things that you need to think about. It's not a GPS in that I'm not going to be telling you, turn here left, turn right here, and add this comma and put this period over there. So that being said, one of the things that we did in preparation for the Data Journey series is we created a synthetic data set using artificial intelligence. And I'm going to be putting the link in the chat, even though it is not necessary for you to look at it in any detail right now. I will be using this data set to demonstrate some of the cleaning workflows in the next workshop. But just things to consider when we are working with artificial intelligence and replicability and reproducibility. So as noted from the example with Deloitte, they were caught because some of the citations included in the report were incorrect. They were quote unquote hallucinations. And I really don't like the term hallucinations. That's just my personal preference, because it kind of like puts the responsibility on the tool as opposed to the people who are using the tool. So just like being accountable and own the process of using AI and being transparent about it. After the errors related to AI were found in that report, a second version of the report was published, where there is a disclosure that AI was used in generating parts of the report. Now, at that stage, disclosure is perhaps not the best indicator of replicability, reproducibility, or trust. So I think that in general, when we're thinking about using AI for any kind of research, we have to be proactive about disclosure. And this includes anything that we use as citations. Each style manual, depending on which discipline you are coming from, will have their stated preferred practices, and they are changing constantly. And the same is true about journals, publishers, granting agencies. So I think that best practice would be to just, if you are thinking about using AI, disclose that as early as possible to anyone involved. And it is also kind of helpful if, when you are reaching out to a journal or to a granting agency, if you come with something more than, is it okay if I use AI? It would be more helpful if you were to say something like, is it okay if I use AI for this particular purpose with this particular data set or subset of the data? This is how I am thinking about keeping confidentiality and explaining some of the process behind why you want to use AI for your purposes. In addition to citing information that was generated through AI, there is disclosure, and the example that you will see in the README file for the dataset I shared on the chat is the 8 framework developed by one of the librarians here at the University of Waterloo. Again, I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't want to say like this is the thing that you should be using for all of your disclosures. Check around with your disciplines, with the granting agencies that you're working with, what works for them. But this is a very good place to start if you have no idea where you're going with disclosing or how to go about doing that. And then again, accountability, as I mentioned earlier, we just want to make sure that at the end of the day, it is a person who is doing all of the research, and like all the implications it is disingenuous to say, oh, it was AI who made me do it. So documentation and sharing, that has been stressed in a number of slides already. So in the set that I shared with you, I have indicated what prompts I used, and I have included a copy of all of the output files with versioning. So this is just an example of how you might go about disclosing that you have used AI and how you might use it. But again, it will be very discipline specific. Could I get the next slide, please? And I noticed that somebody commented in the chat about like seeing an exemplar of the README file. We have a README file template that Annalise has actually created, and it's amazing. And that's the one that I used as the basis for this one that I sent as an example. I'm not going to take too much time here, because I think that we have already heard about all of these concepts in more or less detail, and just being mindful of time. But again, just like these ideas of transparency, creating documentation, not just for the end users, but also for yourself to be able to understand what you did, how you did it, why you did it, and be able to do some more research that is reproducible and replicable. I'm going to pass it over to Annalise, and I will get the link for the README file template while she continues her presentation.
And really the goal here is you want things to be as open as possible and closed as necessary. And you've probably noticed throughout a lot of this that there are some things that come up again and again and again. And there's kind of no way around having this conversation, because it's a lot of the same things that will go into kind of helping to address these issues, but maybe how we address them happens in a number of ways by doing the same things. But remembering that things should be open if possible, and then closed if they need to be, and really kind of are changing our mindset around things should be closed and then open if they need to be. And some of the solutions here, we've talked about some of these things, talking about open science, open research, having open access journals so people can access the research and so things aren't behind paywalls, publishing data in code with your research, which we're starting to see people do more and more, and we're starting to see publishers require these from authors, which does add an additional burden to the author. But if you've done some proper data management as you go and documented things, it shouldn't be a huge lift at the end of a project. It's really just adding that onto the paper, and that data adds a lot of context that's really important. Increasing that documentation, which we see people doing increasingly more and is required for a lot of those data deposits, and really changing the incentive structures at universities. And this is a much tougher solution because this is not a Canadian issue or North American issue. This is really the global structure of higher education and academia that contributes to these issues. So hopefully we'll see policy changes to coming along with this. And we are starting to see some of those policy changes that are already happening in those structural changes through institutions who have adopted the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, which you may have heard, and publishers who are starting to maybe require data deposit or people registering their studies, and publishers requiring that people register their studies, especially those kind of health or clinical trial ones. We're also seeing an increase in data publication because sometimes people are forced to do this. We're not seeing it necessarily out of the willingness of people's hearts to do, but we're starting to see this shift, and we're starting to see an uptake in people who are supporting open science and open data wherever possible. And sometimes it's through these publisher and funder policies, but we are seeing people increasingly value the open data and sharing their data so it is available for people to reuse and check. And we are seeing open research integrated into curriculum and science integrated or open science integrated into curriculum into graduate research studies courses or optional seminars. So we are seeing these things slowly being built in. It's not an overnight thing. It's not a single year thing. This is a really big change. And we know it will work. We've seen the value of it. We've seen what happens when we value things other than traditional publications as research. So the science is there, the data is there to back up that this is going to have positive benefits, but it's going to take a long time to get there. And it's really that kind of cultural change, and those cultural shifts take time, especially when you're talking about something on a global level. But I will hand it to Antonio to wrap up. And then we should have a couple minutes for questions if people want to use the Q&A, or put them in the chat if anyone has questions.
All right, so basically you can all read this, but I will go quickly over our summary. Like the implications, as we mentioned, of doing non-reproducible research are not just academic, and sometimes like that's a very important thing to remember. As we mentioned many times, very good way to ensure more reproducibility and replicability of your data is documenting your research and data throughout the entire process. We also talked about FAIR data and what the acronym means, and also like just noticing what parts of your research may not be reproducible and how you can still be transparent. So for example, in the data set that I mentioned that I created using AI, if you tried to follow the prompts that I used, you probably wouldn't get the exact same data sets that I did. But you have enough context in the README, in the documentation, and the prompts themselves to at least be able to either replicate or understand why the data looks the way it does. And with that, I'm going to open it to Q&A if anyone has something.